Thank you again, everyone. And I'm going to hand over to Louise to start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sophia. Yeah, welcome everyone. So today's session, covering a little bit of everything. So I'm hoping that people in the audience are either planning their next retrofit project, or maybe you're waiting to hear back about your Warms Home project. So we're going to be covering a little bit about on PAS, a little bit about your data, and talking a little bit about the cost and the structures of this in terms of the cost caps, and then moving on to how you can take that information to start to plan your design. So a little bit about myself as well. I've been working on energy efficiency projects, including the government funded schemes, for about 7 years now, starting with eco and so on. And I worked at a local authority in England, despite my accent, for about 2.5 years, and then also have worked in the private sector for about a year in some sort of utilities sort of defence role, then moving into Turner and Townsend for about 2.5 years now, where we've been working on the grant funded schemes from HUG, Warm Homes and SHDF. So my background is mainly on retrofit and the government funded schemes. So hopefully I can provide the insights to you on how to plan your next project. So if you're not familiar already, all of the Warm Homes funded projects have to be compliant with PAS 2035. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it is a retrofit standard, and it really encourages a whole house approach. The reason that this exists is to try and make sure that retrofit is done safely and to a high standard for everyone involved, to make sure that the residents are happy, nothing goes wrong, and that we can achieve the optimum carbon savings set out to achieve with grant funded money and so on. If you are, for example, a housing provider or a council, you might have other projects which are not working to this standard, but you will hopefully be aware that the government funded ones do have to comply with this. So you might also be aware that there is a transfer period at the moment where we're moving from the 2019 sort of standards over to the 2023 ones. If you're not familiar, please do visit the website and get up to date on that, and make sure that you're following that, whether you're delivering any current projects or moving on to deliver the next one. And essentially, PAS 2035 is a sort of overarching standard, but within that, you've kind of got things like the PAS 2030, which is more the actual installation standard. And there are different sort of fundamental aspects around ventilation. The previous one, 2019 one, had the risk pathways. There's some of the changes that you will see are sort of taking on feedback from stakeholders and how they can improve that, looking at how it worked in practice and taking on any improvements. So the 2023 standards are designed just to take that feedback on board. So if we're to look at a few different examples, so basically every project that you do through PAS would have to go through some basic monitoring and evaluation. So that's one you see in the yellow box. There's also the requirement for a handover sort of delivery information to be provided to the resident, making sure that the installer lets the resident know how the piece of, for example, if there's programming or it's a heating system with controls, making sure that the resident has had that handover information. And PAS 2030 is the standard, the install standard to comply with, that sits within that structure. So if you're ever sort of unaware, there is guidance on this. You can download the documentation, and as you'll be aware, you'll need to procure for your Warm Homes projects to make sure that any installers and contractors involved in your project are compliant with this standard. And ideally, you want to kind of know that they have worked to that before and that they're really competent in understanding that. So you'll be aware, if you've looked at the Warm Home guidance, there's bits in the Social Housing Fund and the Local Grant Fund to describe what you need to comply with. So that with PAS, which we've just covered there, there's also Trustmark, so your measures will have to be lodged through this. And you really want to make sure, again, going through any tender specifications when you're doing your procurement, that the contractors are aware of that, and then you can discuss points of, when the payment should come through, when it's lodged or when it's completed, and there'll be certain KPI and trigger points, and hopefully you'll be familiar with this. And if you're not, you hopefully can get some confidence from your contractor that they have either worked this before, or that you can work on it together to understand what is required and by when, and when would you have sort of service level agreements that rotate around things like lodging measures and so on as grant funding is drawn down at certain trigger points. Similarly, there is a MCS, so the Microgeneration Certification Scheme. So this is for renewable measures and PV, for example. So there's also separate guidance on this, so making sure that you're installing to that certification. So a little bit on why we need this, but hopefully you'll all be, maybe hopefully it doesn't need explaining, but essentially in the past, you could previously go on and install a measure, just like loft insulation or cavity wall insulation, and you maybe didn't need to do a whole house assessment, and an installer could do that without looking at the whole house. And really, I kind of see it a bit like, even thinking about how if a doctor was to operate on you, your breathing system, everything is sort of interconnected. If you were to have sort of a hole in one area, then it could be all your air's flowing out. And this is the same way as building, it's a system. And we're looking at it now as a whole house approach and to seeing why that's needed. There's also some really high profile examples of where things have gone wrong in the past, such as Fishwick and so on. And it can lead to damp and mold, which not only then creates issues in terms of you having to contract for remediation and for a surveyor to come out and assess sort of the damage and then potentially reprocure or go through some sort of contract negotiation for remediation, which can all be timely and costly. There is also, the tenants' well-being involved in this. It's not nice to live in a damp home with issues. It can be very stressful for them, mentally, and it can also have sort of physical impacts on sort of any damp and mold conditions. So, and also bearing in mind that these projects are set out to, reduce tenant bills, make the tenants' well-being, improve that, and also save the carbon. And if it's not done to the standard required, then these things that were set out to do are not achieved. So we want everyone to be sort of happy with that. And there are some key principles. So we've talked about PAS there. You might also be familiar with other there's other standards that do exist. That you'll hear things like the Passive House or Retrofit and things like this. The PAS ones are for these government funded schemes. And again, it's encouraging that fabric first approach should be taken. So I think of this as if your bath was overflowing, you don't reach for the mop first. You're trying to turn off that tap first and really seal the envelope or get that airtight. Then there's the considerations there around ventilation, making sure that you've got enough air changes, and viewing the system as a whole. Yeah, so again, just going back to this whole house approach and viewing it as a system rather than just an isolated element, such as we're just doing a cavity wall insulation. So thinking of heat loss, obviously it will vary whether it's detached property or mid-terrace or so on, or an end terrace. So your end terrace might only lose, heat through the three parts of the wall, and detached having the highest heat loss. So you'll see that reflected in an EPC, for example. So a surveyor, a domestic energy assessor will go out and have to put that information into their software, their system, and that also is reflected in your EPC then, how much heat is lost. But you can see here, the walls, you've got your highest percentage of heat loss there. Second then being the roof, and moving through to windows, and then you can even get some through the floor as well, maybe if it's a suspended floor property. So yeah, step one, we want to reduce the heat loss so it can try to improve that envelope. And you can do this, through various different measures depending on the property. But some of you may know, depending on where you are in your retrofit journey, that there are sometimes really easy wins. If it's a straightforward cavity wall property, then you can do the cavity wall insulation. It could be really straightforward, and that's a fantastic win. Whereas then it gets more complicated if you've kind of got more difficult to treat properties. It could be listed, heritage building, or really thick walls, or a really narrow cavity, or it could just be that the cavity is sort of not equal all the way through the property. It could be that there's issues around reasons why you can't install that cavity wall insulation, and that's where things can get a little bit more complicated, and you might have to look at something like EWI, which can be slightly more costly and require more planning and sort of risk management. You know, you've got internal wall insulation, which does cut into your floor area, for example, and can cause issues around, you know, having to re-plaster and redecorate that internal area and sort of resident disruption. And then moving on, you know, you can do other measures. Moving on sounds a bit like a weather forecast there I'm giving, but moving on, you can deliver, you know, innovation measures as well. And there's more difficult measures such as the underfloor insulation, which you can look at, or improving those the efficiency of the glazing and thinking about what is actually really taking an approach and thinking what is actually practical for that property. And what does your housing stock look like? So, and we'll move into next how you're going to look at all your housing stock and then think about what approach might be best for you. Is it based on area schemes, or is it on the tenant's eligibility, or are you trying to get an economies of scale and go for certain measures, and it might even be a mixture. So then you can looking at your moving on from sort of reducing heat loss, you've got those other parts such as decarbonising the heat and hot water in the property. So no matter how much you reduce the heat loss and improve the fabric, you know, you're still going to have to sort of heat the property and have water and so on. So that's another area to target. And we'll move into the funding sort of structures to these schemes and see how you can tackle both of these. But yeah, heat pumps, whether that's appropriate for the property. Obviously, there's some considerations there around the space to have that, if it's, you know, high rise, or looking at those types of solutions, and what the existing one, how inefficient is the existing heating system. So that's kind of the principles that you're wanting to cover. And then if you were then to look at, well, what's my stock? How does it look? So you could start off and say, you know, I've got 2,000 properties and only 1,000 of them are below C, and this is what I'm looking at, this is what I'm dealing with. They might be spread over different areas. You know, you might have lots of sort of system built properties in one area and one pocket that you know need EWI, and then you might have sort of more pepper potted ones that are sort of spread out all over the place with needing cavity wall insulation. And you might be looking at all your housing stock thinking, what's the best way to do this? Some of you will have, you know, really effective in-house data analysis, and it might be quite simple, but it's really looking at, okay, is my EPC data enough? Is it up to date and is it accurate? Or do I really need to actually look at some sort of external software here, or go out and do some sort of sampling, really going out to like a representative property? So if you know that you've got a street where they're all typically the same, or a block that's all typically the same, can you maybe start to do some initial points going out to the property and getting some sort of samples done to represent those and having a look? Yeah, so this is trying to get in a clear baseline for your project. So these are typically all the bits of information that you might need to look at. So, you know, who are the residents? Are you going on a sort of eligibility first approach? Are you, what's the current level? What are your planned maintenance projects? Are you planning sort of some sort of re-roofing program, or were you planning to upgrade a lot of the boilers because they were really old anyway? You know, if you've got some really old storage heaters in some of your flats, and really, you know, how is this spread? It really depends on your geography. Some of you might be really rural. You know, you could have, you know, a whole sort of mountain range in between some of these properties if you're spread over a large area. And you might have some sort of heritage areas as well. So some of you may have your own software systems that you can use, or you maybe heard of things like GM or Parity and so on. So this is examples of some of the dashboards that you can see. Some of you might do this at more sort of a basic Excel level. And really you can start to split this into different archetypes, and sometimes splitting your properties into archetypes can be one of the easiest ways to simplify things. So you can then know you've kind of got your detached homes that are this, or you have semi-detached ones that need cavity wall insulation. You can kind of start to slice and dice that any way that you think is best for the project. And what I would really highly recommend is to make sure that things are quite easy to flex and toggle, so that if you decide to come along and it turns out that for whatever reason, you know, you've lost your contractor that could do that measure, or it turns out that the street that you wanted to do that was going to have this measure, you've gone out to them and actually the data that you held was really inaccurate. If you need to then change your property project at quite short notice, you really want something that's easy to toggle and change. I think what you don't want to have is something that's really laborious, and that anytime you change something, it's going to require, really rely on one person spending a lot of time on it. And you want to make it nice and simple. And you can run different scenarios then for your own benefit and for the project results. So here are some examples. You might want to look at, okay, what would it cost if we wanted to improve, 75% of our stock to EPCD or C or B. You'll know that most of the social housing fund is designed really to take the properties up to EPCC, but that's not to say that if you wanted to do your own investment on top of that to get them to higher than an EPCC, that could be something that you might be interested in. And what some people want to do that is to, well, they're out of the properties at that time, they want to get them done then and there, well, if they're already there. But each housing provider and so on, it does vary. So you've looked at that, then imagine you've looked at all your properties, you've got this many thousands or this many hundreds, and you can archetype them, and there's different ways you can do that. Take your EPC data or any other commissioned retrofit data that you might have, pull that together, and really you want to sort of filter those by columns into, it could be heating type or the sort of fabric type, as in, is it a cavity wall or solid wall, and your EPC part, is it detached and so on, and start to create sort of tags almost. And if it does help you think of how to do that, as imagine you were trying to do this with something completely different. If someone was trying to sort of itemize or catalog, I don't know, like stock of food, or it could be any kind of topic. How would you take something if you have thousands of something and you want to break it down into different categories? It's just trying to simplify it into smaller groups. So then you have to then consider, okay, well, that's what our stock is, but we actually need to get the best results here in terms of what the cost cap structuring is for the grant funding. So you'll know in the past that there was different cost caps on different schemes, so please do check the guidance. And I'm going to go do a high level of this one, but really, if you're ever unsure, you can refer to the guidance on this one, and hopefully you can engage with RISE if you need further support. But essentially, the social housing scheme does have the co-funding requirements, and there's sections here about the off-gas and on-gas, and there's also a low carbon heat incentive. So then you need to take this information and look at, well, how does that sort of fit into what our project could be? Thinking about what you would be open to, what you would be able to co-fund really based on your housing stock. And bearing in mind that in order to get this funding, you need to have the sort of buy-in from your budget at a high level. The local grant is a little bit more open in the sense of this is owner occupiers and private rental properties. So it's quite open there, but it does have a different structure for if it's a landlord property. So a private rental property, the funding does change for whether it's the landlord's first home and second home and so on. So hopefully that is quite basic. So then, for example, here, if the landlords have the low income tenants that meet the household eligibility criteria, then yes, that does vary between the first home structure. You can see that there's not the landlord contribution, but then when you move into that second property and subsequent properties, it moves into requiring a landlord contribution. And you can see the guidance, for example, that if you go into the guidance as well, the landlord contribution, there's the sort of minimum requirement, but that can go above and beyond if they're willing to do so. Yep, and again, we have a different structure for low carbon heating. So it's just separating out those fabric measures and the low carbon heating measures, so splitting them into two different parts. You can have some infill properties in both schemes, but there's caps on these as well. So this is really just that is designed to try and make sure that if you have an area or a building or a block of properties which there's maybe one different tenure in that block, say you've got a private rental property in amongst all your social housing or vice versa, what we want to try and make sure is that those types of projects can still go ahead because it's recognised that it would be, really efficient and beneficial to do those projects all in one go. And therefore, there is some thresholds and capacities around how much you can include. So there's a little bit of leeway. I would probably encourage, if you are, especially if you're consortia applicant, is to really discuss that with the consortia lead to understand what your sort of thresholds might be, because there's the overall threshold of the application, and then how your consortia might divvy that up between you is something to consider. Then you need to move into what is A&A. So this is the admin and ancillary, and you've got capital costs. So your A&A where you can cover some of your staff fees and more sort of administrative items. And your capital costs is like, the measures and so on. However, DESNAs do try to be quite flexible to allow you to move some of them between the two for you to decide which sort of section it lies in for some of these. So I would say please check the guidance and, be sensible around what looks appropriate, but there is some leeway for you to move things around. And yeah, the scheme hopefully is designed to make sure that you can you're able to sort of have people in roles. Appreciate that with different schemes, you want to have that role continuity and to have someone that feels comfortable and secure in their job that they can sort of stay on for a project. And then you would want to design your target outcomes. So if we talk about the target outcomes, I said earlier on the social housing fund is designed to get properties to C. So really it is designed mainly to get to C rather than much higher. And then if you want to go higher, then you can use, for the social housing fund, you can use your own co-funding to go higher at the same time, if that's something that you're planning on doing, while you're out there, while you're doing that install, to go further than the C. So really, you might have your own. There's a bit of flexibility in this one, as in if you've got your own sort of fabric first versus low carbon approach, it really will depend on the property. And the low carbon heating on the gas grid, so that they'll know from previous schemes. I think things like Hug 2 was for off gas, so trying to be a bit more flexible and how you can coordinate that. You can also look at things like how it works with any heat pump or heat networks. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Next, you have identifying the target properties. So you've identified your outcomes, as in what's driving your project, and then you want to take that on to the next more granular level on how to identify the target properties that match your intended outcome. So really, in order to be able to do this, you're going to have a really clear and accurate picture of your housing stock. Really, the EPC data does typically, it could be, some of it could be quite inaccurate. EPCs can be valid for 10 years and the properties might not be sold. That's only for properties being sold, or you might have it as a requirement for a rental property as well. But for example, if you're doing the local grant, you might not have an accurate picture really of what that stock looks like. It's definitely a lot more difficult with a local grant because you could have lots of owner occupiers and which have not had an EPC done on their property for years. Depending on the area, I'm just thinking about, a particular sort of street area in Scotland where there's just no one's had an EPC because no one's moved house in years, sort of thing. So that can happen. You've got to think about how can you then get the accurate picture. And then taking in your cost caps, your intended outcomes, and that you've got to be compliant with PAS and Trustmark and so on. And I would say probably at this stage is really when you kind of want to go out and you've engaged with your contractors to see what the cost could be as well, based on what they can actually offer you locally or whoever your contractor is. Take this information all take it all back, and then you've got to sort of shape and tweak which you think is the most appropriate project for you. Bearing in mind a lot of you might be working to the 2030 sort of net zero targets and thinking about, okay, this batch of funding, most of them run to 2028. If you're running to a 2030 net zero target and so on, how can you decarbonise your stock by that goal with this funding running to 2028? And then making sure that if there's sort of leftovers or ones that are not going to be targeted by these schemes, how will those be funded, for example? Yeah, and whether that's going to be that you're going for your sort of easy to treat properties that you know are your low-hanging fruit, you've got lots of sort of cavity wall insulation needing done, or have you actually got some sort of historically difficult notorious ones that have just not made it through any previous schemes because they've always been too difficult. Maybe they require a lot more engagement with your planning department, and maybe you can start to look at that now, and maybe line them up to be included in that project. Then we move on to preliminary design, and we're going to go through this just now, and then the next part we'll go through some sort of risk assessment through different stages. So once you've looked at your target properties, it moves on to how can you compile this together into the project. So the existing data, get that kind of moved on to the next stage. Can be quite difficult as sometimes it's to draw a line and then say, right, well, this is what we're going with. And then the right team, as in who's going to be working on this? Is it you looking to upskill and build your resource internally? Do you have the capacity to do so? Are they on other schemes, and can that role be continued? Are you going to have to sort of recontract for that role to be extended and so on? Or is some of this things that you would rather outsource? Can you get sort of any fixed term contracts, or are you looking for more of a turnkey solution? And some of these decisions really will be around how much skilled would you like to build in your own organisation, and how much do you think it's just more beneficial to outsource where appropriate? And then you've got to think as well around, if this is with a contractor, again, how much information do they need to know about your stock, and what's the best way for them to get that information? So then you can move on to planning this. So sometimes if you're looking at a contractor, they can actually help you with this. And other times you would want to drive it more yourself to say, well, this is what we want. I think as well, it's got to be considering here around what is the sort of economies. Sometimes a contractor will offer sort of economies of scale, and that is why they're pushing a certain solution. And then maybe that works for you, but it's making sure that that solution is also something that you want. And if you're looking at more of an area-based approach, or an eligibility-based approach, then to make sure that you can push that in the direction you need it to go in. Yeah. So moving on then, we move into the sort of risk assessment stages. So there's a few different stages which we're going to go through now. I think I need to press a little bit. How do I get the next bit to come up? There we go. So at each stage, there'll be different factors to consider. So at your assessment stage, I mean, please feel free to sort of put things in the chat if you think there's other sort of things you need to consider at each stage. But essentially, at your assessment stage, yeah, it's considering, well, what if your data that you previously had was inaccurate, and the assessor themselves, I mean, you've got to think about, well, how many are you going to get them out to do every single property at what stage, or are you wanting to do representative parts at the early stage and then move into taking forward which properties then are you wanting to take forward for the project? And really, if the assessor, are you subcontracting that? Are you doing that? And how can you sort of quality check certain items? Each organisation does choose to do things in a slightly different way. Some of them like to have someone skilled and internally, qualified as like a retrofit coordinator or a retrofit assessor that can almost sort of like mark the contractor work, and some of them choose to do that, and others are happy not having that and trusting the contractor. Really, anyone who is qualified as a retrofit role as an assessor or coordinator, they do have to comply with the the standards and the certifications to be accredited. It is sort of quality checked and assured. So really, if the assessor should always, no matter what project it is, they always have to comply with the standards that they're bound by for their certification body. So really, at the moment, that is up to the organisation to decide what suits them best. Then you can think about things like an occupancy assessment as well at the assessment stage. You could go out to the property. It can be handy to know like a situation of what's going on there. There could be all kinds of things that you just didn't expect. There can be decking covering things, or conservatory, guttering, sheds, all types of sort of fixtures which might make EWI difficult, or it might make access difficult. You could go into the property and find out, there's hoarding, or you can't access the loft, and things like these can then be really challenging, or like a chimney could be blocked. Things like that can be very challenging, because in order for a retrofit assessor to really get the full accurate picture of the house, they do need access to every part of the property, and if they can't access a certain bit to check how it is, then it makes it very difficult to move on to the next stage. So that can really cause a bit of a blocker and be an obstacle. Then we move on to design. So let me get the next little bits up. At your design stage as well, this is where, again, there's different roles in this. So even the communication between a retrofit assessor, designer, and coordinator, and so on, you need to have really good communication here, and sort of trust in them that they've done this before. But really, anything going wrong in here, if it's not designed properly, it doesn't have the right ventilation, you can end up with sort of damp and mold, guttering sort of done wrong, leaks coming into properties, and so on. So this is where really the design stage, that should all be kind of detailed in your contracts anyway, that it's done to the right standards and that everyone's done to the right measure. Yeah, overheating can also becoming more of an issue these days. And also, tenant expectations is that sometimes when we talk about these schemes, they might think that they're getting some particular measures, and actually it's probably best not to promise any specific measures, because it can be that once you go out and do the survey, really from early doors, you can't really promise that someone would get PV or heat pump or so on, because it's not until you've done the assessment and the design stage that you know what that household will actually get. And then it can be an issue of what of that, then at that point they actually don't want that, and you've kind of done a survey. Things like that can be a bit challenging. Then the installation itself. So there could be all kinds of things here really around making sure that the actual equipment itself used is to the high standard, as in if you're installing heat pumps or actual capital measures, making sure that insulation is actually the right quality, that the PV is the right quality, that rails and so on are done in the right way for PV, and then that transpires through from when the design is done. It could be that something's the wrong size, having to go back, and things can end up being more and more visits, more and more time, which cost the tenant disruption, and then it can impact onto other sort of the cascading, changing all of your subsequent installations. So really everything needs to be properly done at each stage, but I think it's making sure that everyone has sight of, really, in people that are doing the installation, you want every party really to have as much sight of each part as they can, so that there's not the chance really for something to sort of manifest and go wrong, that you can be preventative, having everyone sort of sign different bits off at different stages, so that there's no surprises. Then we talk about the operation, which is really, you've designed all this and it should go right, but what if actually what was meant to be done doesn't happen in practice? So this can be that actually you've gone out to the property and it's meant to be saving energy, you're meant to monitor that, and actually it turns out that there's something gone wrong. There's sort of a leak coming down one wall, damp and mold, making sure that tenants know how to use the controls and so on. So making sure that that's achieving the sort of energy performance that you set out to achieve. and that there's no issues with technology. And this could be something that could be so easily fixed, that could be something really simple, but I think it's just making sure that you have adequately resourced for this. And then this could be that when you're going out to tender, you need to make sure things like this are included. Your installer should really know that because it's part of the PAS process as well. If you wanted to add on, your additional tenant sort of handover visits, some people might choose to do the Warm Homes project and they might want to tie on some sort of, like a wellbeing survey. You could be taking part in sort of other research projects. You might be tagging on other projects and other funding onto this. It really will just be specific to your organisation. But it's effectively making sure that the handover has been done properly, the tenant knows how to use any technologies or controls, and also considering as well, what if that head tenant was to move out and a new one was to move in, would there be appropriate handovers as well? If you've got your own sort of asset maintenance database, you'll have records of what was installed when and when someone needs to go out next, and that documentation is all on your system. So you've got the contractors done their bits and got all of the documents, making sure that you have a copy on your own database. So now we'll just talk about some of the resources. However, for time, yeah, we're doing okay. There's a few different resources. So there's more RISE events you can attend. So engaging heating tenants with heating technology is one of them, building your business case and project plan. And there's a few online resources there. You will get a copy of the slides so you can access those. We've also got toolkits and so on. There's podcasts, and I'm also going to share what events are coming up next. So next week, we have the challenge of retrofitting historic buildings on Monday. We have the integrating the monitoring evaluation, so that kind of tying on to some of the stuff we talked about there with the handovers with PAS and the installation process. And then there's the guide to planning and retrofit on Thursday and the policy review one. Although I think that one might be full at the moment. This has been, a sort of high level approach and hopefully helping you go through how to go take your housing stock that you have at the beginning, what the government schemes require. So just to recap on what those government schemes have to comply with, you have PAS, Trustmark and MCS. And then on top of that, you do have your cost cap structures, which are dependent on whichever scheme you're doing, whether that's the Social Housing Fund or whether that is the local grant. So taking these into consideration and then also thinking about how you can move into making sure that your contractor is able to deliver that to the standard you need. But yeah, that was everything I was going to cover. So I just want to say thank you for attending really, and happy to take some questions. Or there's actually a little bit of time back as well if there's no questions.